Hello and welcome to another episode of Between Two Psychs with myself, Mike, and Adam McCartney. And today we're going to be talking about Key Stage 3 and transitions and all things to do with Key Stage 3. So good afternoon, Adam.
Afternoon, Mike. How's it going?
It's going well, thank you. Going well. So we're talking about Key Stage 3. So for the benefit of all people listening, this is Year 7 to Year 9. What have you been thinking?
When we had an episode on exclusions, one of the things that came out of it was that in Key Stage 3, we see a rapid incline in exclusions, particularly since 2014. And obviously, that's got to do with the change in budget constraints around secondary schools in particular. And it's got me thinking about how do schools manage that transition? Well, we know it's a point that's difficult for many schools to manage. Some secondary schools can manage better than others. Some primary schools can manage better than others. But quite often what we see is that their children do thrive within a primary school setting. And when they get to secondary school, those resources aren't there. And I kind of want to explore what's the impact of that and what can educators do to support those children.
Sure. I actually think, Adam, when you say the resources aren't there, I actually think the resources are there, but they're different. And this is part of the issue around transitioning out of Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3 is knowing that they're there, but they're different, and knowing what support is available and how we're going to prepare the Year 6 children for that entry into Year 7.
Right. So if we're saying they're different, give us an example of what's the first difference that comes to mind but once you enter Key Stage 3.
Size is one thing, and dealing with the fact. I mean, we've been saying it since I left primary school. You know, a big fish in a small pond, and suddenly you're the small fish in the big pond. You know, that can have a huge impact on many people. Not everyone, but certainly enough that's making us talk today.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other things are you move from having one secure teacher or a secure relationship with one teacher into having to build relationships with many teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the next thing is the level of the curriculum steps up a gear.
Yeah, and not only the level of the curriculum, the nature by which you expect that they learn. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about nurture-based provision within primary schools.
Yeah.
And the approach generally within secondary schools is to promote independent learning to a greater extent. You still get support from your teachers, but you're expected to get yourself from class A to class B. You're expected to organize your materials and those things. And for many students, that can still be an issue. And it can lead to greater levels of unhappiness, which is one of the contributing factors to this rise in exclusions.
Yep. And in terms of that unhappiness, you're absolutely right. The things that could be causing that unhappiness, one thing for me would be not being able to cope, and we put that under the banner of resilience. Is there anything else that you think might contribute towards unhappiness?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, you already alluded to it, there's a big discrepancy between building a relationship with one key adult who can do a lot for you. In a primary school setting, your class teacher can sort out a lot of problems. And having to do that across, say, 5, 6 to 10 different teachers of all varying personalities and varying degrees of, their approach to teaching. Some will be very nurture-based, others will be very compliant-based. And as a child of any ability, that can be confusing. And you'll naturally get along with some teachers more than others. And I suppose what I'm thinking about are those vulnerable students, those who come from backgrounds where they're more likely to they have emotional disruptions, or those who are going to have social communication difficulties, or those who go through a period of life that is challenging. I'm thinking those who lose a family member or things. Sometimes their behaviors can struggle to get back on board. And you really need a system. I understand the need to promote independence, but that needs to be transitioned into rather than dropped into, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking there, Adam, I was thinking about the theory that many of us consider when we're looking at children and behaviour and settling in, etc., is the area of learned helplessness. And, if children repeatedly feel like they have no control, they may stop trying. And we often get asked to consider EBSA or emotion-based school avoidance or other sorts of pre-EBSA behaviours that are to do with children disengaging.
Yeah,
Does that fit in with what you were?
it does.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the word control. And one of our earlier episodes, we talked about applying resilience frameworks for staff. And one of those things was around feeling empowered. Now, what we know about the human brain, the human psyche, is that feeling in control is central to well-being. You got to feel that you've got some autonomy over your life. In theory, that should work within a secondary setting. You have the control to go from class A to class B. There's also an expectation. So you may have the autonomy to do it, but the demand is also placed on you. You're expected to do it independently. And as humans, we often want to feel supported. We want to feel like somebody's going to catch us if we fall. And for many students with varying levels of independent needs, whether that's social emotional needs or those with sensory-based needs, that can be a greater challenge. But as I'm saying this, I'm trying to think of what secondary schools might say in response. And many of them will say, we do a transition plan. Many do summer schemes. Many spend the first month trying to support students how to get around the building. They will have named adults who are dedicated in that pastoral support. And yet these issues occur. Even some schools will have dedicated classrooms that try and maintain the primary school setting. So they have maybe 10 to 15 students who will only access one classroom throughout the day, and the teachers will go in there rather than the students moving. And yet we still see this rise in exclusion since 2014. Now, there's many reasons for that. I think one of the years there was a drop, but that probably came down to COVID. And it's something that just baffles me is, there's many things happening within the lives of these students. We spoke in the past about identity issues. And I suppose what I'm trying to do with you here and now is explore which factor is the main one that needs to be tackled first in order to reduce these exclusions. And when we're saying reducing exclusions, what we're really saying is promoting happiness amongst younger people.
Nicely reframed, Adam. And I think when you start to look at it as promoting happiness rather than reducing exclusions, it starts to give you a handle for things that we could consider. Promoting happiness. So one of the things I was thinking about that has been good practice was the beginning of transitioning into Key Stage 3, but beginning it in Year 5. Because Year 6 is a busy year. It's difficult to do a lot of developmental work. There's so much focus on academics. So Year 5 is often a good year to start thinking about what's going to happen in Key Stage 3, and that could be partnership working between the Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 staff. But one of the programs I'm coming to it's an example of a program, and it's called Friends for Life. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a very good program for what you've said, which is aiming for happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And the happiness comes from a variety of factors in that program. For example, emotional intelligence, being able to recognize and manage emotion, particularly troublesome emotions or those that lead to self-doubt. It talks about strategies for managing yourself and for coping in challenging situations. So although it's I suppose comes under the banner of mental health and well-being, I think it fits nicely into your word of happiness for Key Stage 4.
Yeah, I like that in the sense that it promotes resilience. You said it was to teach emotional literacy. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it links back to what we were chatting to Gillian about last week when we spoke about supervision. And one of her last words before the end of the episode was that educators should take some responsibility for their introspection, their, acknowledging their skill sets. And in a way, teaching children emotional literacy promotes introspection. However, anyone that listens to me on other podcasts or me online knows that I advocate a lot for connection. And I think that's one of the missing factors within Key Stage 3 is how do you go from a very tight-knit Year 6 class with a clearly defined leader, i.e. the teacher, into a much looser, autonomous, independent structure that is secondary school, whereby you can have up to 10 different lessons and 10 different relationships. Where does the sense of connection come from? And what we know about human beings is the more you feel connected to other people in a meaningful way, shared identity and things like that, the better you feel, the more resilient you feel, the more engaged with your community you feel. And as we know, schools are up until you're 18, usually 16 for other people, are the biggest communities you're a part of. How do we get those connections is my question.
Yeah. What would give us happiness in a connection?
Connection, again, going back to shared identity. When you have a shared experience with someone, you automatically start to engage in what promotion of a shared identity. So take, for example, a football team. You play football together, therefore you and whoever is on your team, you're all engaging in the same activity. You identify around that activity. You engage in dialogue around that activity. The more you do that, the more you have shared understanding around football, the more you understand how people respond to topics within football or actions within football, the more you understand that person's response in other scenarios, the closer you feel to them because you understand them on a deeper level than is superficial. How do we achieve that within schools? We spend a lot of time focusing on academics. Is there something to be said around a greater emphasis on PHSE? Is there more about citizenship? Is there more about introspection? I don't know. What do you think?
I agree with what you're saying there, Adam, particularly when you belong to a group and the group has a shared identity and a shared purpose. That's certainly part of it. But we could also say that not all people belonging to a team are happy.
Yeah, we could say that.
And so what gives people happiness when they're in a group whilst other people in that same group aren't happy?
You know what I'm going to say? It's acceptance. It's those people that are happier feel that they have lived up to the expectations or the internal frameworks of that group. So quite often in schools, those who are labeled as having SEND or additional needs or a social disability often don't feel accepted. Those with social issues or those who've experienced trauma often don't feel accepted. And if they don't feel accepted, then their happiness is going to be affected. If their happiness is affected, their behavior is affected, their ability to connect with their teachers and their peers is affected. And then we see the rise in exclusions. So for those students on the fringes, it must feel like a very turbulent time going from a primary school where they probably experience difficulties, moving into a secondary school that feels even bigger, less supportive, less accepting in many ways, not intentionally. I want to be clear about that. It's not intentional less acceptance, but by the very nature of the building and the frameworks that people work within, those students must feel more marginalized.
I'm sure. And again, I think it's something else that's correct, which is acceptance. You mentioned something in that answer, which I think is also interesting, which is that some people in that group get happiness from a sense of achievement. So there's an internal dialogue or an internal structure within people that is almost like a goal setting mechanism or a self-evaluation mechanism. And if you don't have a vision from the group, and if you don't have an internal vision and an internal set of goals, it must feel as if everything's quite overwhelming. It must feel like you're kind of washed out, you just don't feel like you can get a grip of things.
Mm.
And I can only imagine that if I was in that situation, I would not be feeling happy.
No, I doubt you would be. You said something there about internal goals, internal vision. How does an education system or school institution promote a vision set and framework for children? We talk a lot about values within school, philosophies or their policy setting. You'll see it on their marketing materials, whereby we're an aspiring school, we're a belonging school. Different words for different schools. Does that have an impact when you enter in year 7, or does something else have to happen?
I think it does, and I think something else also has to happen. How do we get an internal set of goals? So for many people, let's not forget that their transitioning to Key Stage 3 is successful.
Mm-hmm. The majority.
Yeah. So we're not talking about, a whole school system needed or a whole year group approach required. But it's like performance management that we have every year as employees, where our line manager will talk to us about corporate targets or, strategic targets. And that would relate to a question about, what we're going to achieve as a school, what's our ethos, so you help those small group of young people understand the ethos and the purpose and so forth. So that would be like the corporate goals. But a good performance management will also then talk to the person about what do you want to achieve over the next 12 months. And if we adopt that sort of conversation into a transition conversation, we start to help that young person to develop those internal goals so that they themselves can say, right, this is where I'm going. This is what I'm trying to achieve. And this is what I need from you or other people to help me achieve it.
You're absolutely right. Because one of the things we know about turnover rates in organizations is where performance managers, as you just said, don't value the employees or don't give them opportunities to progress towards those aims, they tend to leave. And that's the beauty of employment. You can leave. School's a much harder place to leave from, and usually children opt using their behavior as a tool to leave, consciously or subconsciously. But how do we introduce something like that within an education system? So if you take, when I was at school, I think there was 10 form. It was a 10 form entry at secondary school, 25 students per class, I think, roughly. The 10 form tutors. Is it down to the form tutor to figure out 25 different aims and have an appreciation for the school's value systems and where the school wants to go?
I think it's having worked in secondary school, I think, yes, form tutors are a key part of that. The head of year, when they're doing a year assembly, is part of that. The head of key stage, when they're doing a key stage assembly, is part of that. The staff, and I would be one of those when I was a teacher, walking around the school during break times, listening to the young kids, that's part of that. It's not hard work to do that as a teacher. It's just remembering that we have a purpose beyond the classroom. So we do have to teach, but we also have to develop and encourage growth. And I see a lot of good practice in secondary schools around that.
Yeah,
So,
likewise. But regardless of because what we're given, Mike, is really anecdotal evidence. I keep coming back to, but there's this massive figure of exclusions rising between year 7 and year 9. So there's something going wrong. Each year it gets higher and higher. So like we can say things like lack of resources and things like that, but I feel like we're onto something around how to get children to envisage their life within the system, and the teacher being the key part of achieving that. Now, what you described just now feels like an ad hoc system where a teacher notices something and then responds to it. Does there need to be a proactive element to that system?
I think so, Adam, and I'm no longer a secondary school teacher. I'm certainly not in the SLT of a secondary school. So it would be more interesting maybe we'd have somebody come on and talk about the sorts of things like that.
Don't worry, I've got it in the works. I've got it in the works.
But from an ed site point of view, going back to the thing that we said a few minutes ago, that this is not for all children, because there's a lot of children do transition successfully. But when you said, well, what can we do? It's things like, I've mentioned already the Friends for Life program, but there's another evidence-based approach, which is very good for, those sort of individual or paired or small group conversations, which is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, which we call CBT. So the combination of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and that triangle, which, is something that's in all of us. And that program is called Coping Cat. And it's a very well researched program for things like anxiety or other negative thoughts that might enter into a child's thinking when they're moving into key stage 3. But that sort of program teaches children how to recognize negative thoughts or anxious thoughts and how to challenge unhelpful appraisals of themselves and to gradually expose to learn situations and also look at practicing coping strategies. So although it sounds therapeutic, it still fits into the coaching conversations, which are solution focused, to help a young person to structure their internal goals and to talk about, when I'm not achieving success, this is how I feel, or this is the sort of thing I say to myself. And that Coping Cat program can help to address those things.
I like that, especially the challenge and appraisals of oneself and goal setting almost. However, that seems like at a very individualistic level, or the individual level. And we were just chatting about how to integrate the child's value system to be aligned with the schools, or if not completely aligned, to the point where they can still feel like they can build bonds with other peers or with teachers, so that everybody's converging on a point to greater or lesser degrees. Does that Coping Cat program allow children to set goals for themselves in line with the school's value systems, or is it a case of they're going to need support from a key member of staff in order to do that?
They would need support, but they don't have to do it on a one-to-one. The adults can do it in small groups. So we're going back again to the idea that there's a small group of children will require this input rather than the whole class. So I would imagine that a whole class is looking at PSHE type content and looking at the school and the visions of the school and how I fit into this as an individual member and how I belong to part of the community. And then there'll be a small group of children that just need that extra help to clarify their thoughts and to clarify their thinking about how to deal with things.
Yeah, I like that. I think as well, there's a word of caution for teachers around doing this, because I'm trying to think of my own school days. We used to do goal setting and we had to do SMART targets and things like that. But they made it very clear it was academic focused. You're going to try and write goals that will boost your French score or your science score, whichever one you didn't do as well in the Christmas exams. And I think what we're saying here, this is more about community-based goal setting. Whether if you feel that you're socially on the fringe, what are you going to do over the next month to make that lesser? Or is it a case you're going to initiate 2 conversations with 2 peers that you're vaguely familiar with? Is it a case of you're going to ask for help from a teacher on a topic that you struggle with, or a teacher that you struggle with emotionally? You find them quite abrasive. And I think that's the key difference here, is that we're saying it's about how to integrate those students into the wider community and give them the autonomy to do that, but not getting wrapped up in the things that drive teacher performance, things like attainment and Ofsted performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like these therapeutic conversations, or what I would call a coaching conversation, is about aiming, supporting that young person to achieve that pursuit of happiness that you mentioned at the beginning, and to be able to start thinking, okay, so I don't get on with that particular teacher, or I don't like that teacher, or I don't feel I can ask that teacher for support. So these sort of coping cat approaches will help you to start saying, well, hang on a minute, what can I do then? Or who can I talk to about this? Rather than all school is difficult, all teachers don't get on with me, so you go from the globalizing to the specific, and that can help as well in terms of pursuing happiness, but also staying in school.
And, we're coming to the end of this episode, but I want to flip that on its head and say, like, we've been focusing very much from the student's perspective and what they can do to set their goals. I'm just wondering, is there an element of teachers who are struggling with aspects of accepting the student community or aspects of the student community? Should they also engage in this coping cat strategy?
Great. Yeah, because it is. Schools are an organism, aren't they? They are a living, breathing organism, and we're talking about the children, and we're completely forgetting about the other part of the organism, which is the adults. Yeah.
Yeah. Because, anecdotally, and I know you have as well, we come across students that are really struggling. And when you dig down, they've got a difficulty with one particular teacher. And then when you go and speak with that teacher, you learn that they're not going to change their approach. And it can be a really difficult issue to unpick. And I wonder if, something like this was revisited every so often, saying like, okay, look, you're having difficulty with these several groups of students. They all share this characteristic. Is there something about that characteristic that triggers you or you struggle with? It might be they all struggle with reading. They might have dyslexia, or they just struggle with respect and boundaries, which is probably the thing that comes up the most. How line management within schools, supporting that. And we spoke with Gillian last week about supervision. Although this isn't the supervision that we were talking to there, it is a structured conversation that might support teacher development.
It's worth just saying in this episode, the one before it, where we met with Gillian, was about staff burnout. A lot of the conversation in that episode was about this very thing that you're talking about now, Adam. So if anyone listening,
are you telling me people don't listen to these in sequence?
if they don't, it's well worth looking at the burnout episode with Gillian. And we're talking about the requirement, the deep need from her findings for supervision, how line managers can use the approaches of supervision in performance management.
Excellent. I think we could stop there, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Adam. That was very interesting.
Cheers. Chat to you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.